Hello, everybody. I'm glad to see you at uh, our lecture on the discipline and history of the English language. Today it's our second lecture, and today we'll discuss the problems related to phonetic peculiarities of Germanic languages. Like any other group of languages, any other families of languages, Germanic group of languages has some peculiarities which make this group of languages different from other groups of languages of Indo-European family and Indo-European family from other families. They are as follows. The first feature of Germanic, first phonetic peculiarity feature of Germanic language is the first consonant shift. The second one, dynamic stress in the root syllable. Third one, reduction of unstressed syllables. And next one, phonetic lengthening of consonants. And the fifth one, Werner's law. These are commonly accepted features of Germanic languages, which are missing in other language groups and families of the world. Now, about each of them in some details. The first consonant shift, or Grimm's law, the first consonant shift of Germanic languages. It has one more name. Its the second name is Grimm's law. It's because this law was worked out by two scholars. First, Rasmus Christian or Rask, Danish scholar. He lived. He was born in 1787 and died in 1832. And Jacob Ludwig Grimm. Uh, Jacob Grimm was a famous German linguist and fairy tale collector. He was born in 1785 and died in 1863. Many of us know him as a fairy tale collector, and we maybe you read some of his fairy tales of German uh, German people. See? Uh, Rasmus Rask and Jacob Grimm observed the cases of regular correspondences between Indo-European and Germanic languages in the sphere of consonants. And Jacob Grimm wrote about it in his famous book Deutsche Grammatik, or German Grammar, in 1822, as he was the first to describe it in a book. This law was named as Grimm's law. He worked out statements, and this law is explained in three statements. We know these as statements of Grimm's law. Now, those statements are: the first statement of Grimm's law: Indo-European voiceless stops correspond to Germanic voiceless fricatives. For example, Indo-European correspond to Germanic. Second statement: Indo-European voiced stops correspond to Germanic voiceless stops. For example, Indo-European b, d, g correspond to German p, t, k. The third statement: Indo-European aspirated stops correspond to Germanic voiced stops without aspiration. These are three statements of Grimm's law. He also explained that the original system of grammatical consonant alteration in Germanic languages was f, b, f, d, h, g, w, and s, r. Now, examples for those correspondences described in Grimm's law. The first statement in the European, we take mostly the materials words from the Latin language, and in some cases, Russian and Sanskrit languages. For Germanic languages, we take words from Gothic and English language because we know these languages better than other Germanic languages. And besides that, Latin language is we have lots of information, material about the Latin language. We have corresponding dictionaries, and therefore we'll take materials from words from the Latin language. The first statement, the first example, Latin pater corresponds to Gothic father. Last time we said that we also described the Gothic language. We take this is a dead language, and some of you may ask why do we take the material of the Gothic of the dead language when there are lots of living Germanic languages. It's because Gothic language was one of the oldest languages of Germanic group, and besides that, lots of material survived from the Gothic language, especially Gothic Bible gives us much information about the structural features of the Gothic language. Therefore, now we take the examples from the Gothic language. So Latin pater corresponds to Gothic father. P corresponds to f. Next, Latin tres corresponds to English three. T corresponds to Latin noctem corresponds to Gothic nachts. K corresponds to her of Germanic languages. Now, second statement. Russian slabый corresponds to English sleep, not weak. Weak is a translation. Here it corresponds to the word sleep. S, L, B, and also S, L, P in the English language. Latin duo corresponds to English two. Latin deco corresponds to Gothic tehun. And Latin granum corresponds to English corn. G, K. Latin quod corresponds to English what. And now examples to third statement. Sanskrit bhratar corresponds to English brother. As you know, in the first case we have voiced consonant with aspiration. In the second case, voiced consonant without aspiration, brother. Sanskrit bharami corresponds to Gothic beran, to bear, infinitive adverb to bear. Here, Sanskrit aspirated bh corresponds to Gothic b without aspiration. So next, Sanskrit madhu corresponds to Gothic medu, which is translated into English as honey. Next example, Russian goсть corresponds to English guest. Now I will speak about Werner's law. Werner's law was formulated by Danish scholar Karl Werner in 1877. If you remember, Grimm's law was announced in 1822, and after that all scholars interested in the problems of Indo-European languages and Germanic languages used the statements of Grimm's law in their investigation, and in some cases they found out that there were some seeming exceptions from the law put forward by Jacob Grimm and Rasmus Rask. And they began making comments saying that Jacob Grimm's law was weak because it cannot explain all the cases of correspondences, and therefore they they suggested not to use the law as something worth discussing. But there were some scholars who knew that there should be something which could explain those cases of seeming exceptions. One of them was Danish scholar Carl Werner. And in 1877, he finished his investigation on the problems of seeming exceptions from Grimm's law, and he found out he saw that there was a certain law which seemed exception in Grimm's law. So he formulated it in this way. If an Indo-European voiceless stop was preceded by an unstressed vowel, the voiceless fricatives which developed from it, in accordance with Grimm's law, became voiced, and later this voiced fricative became a voiced stop. As an example, he gave the following words. Greek deka, Russian deset, Gothic tehun. Here, k corresponds to Indo-European. K corresponds to h of Germanic languages. This corresponds to Grimm's law. This is in accordance with Grimm's law, because here in Grimm's law we find k corresponds of k to h. But in Werner's example, Greek dekas corresponds to Russian desiatek, corresponds to Gothic digus. Instead of voiceless fricative, we find here voiced plosive, voiced stop. And first, if this example puzzled many scholars before Karl Werner, Karl Werner could explain how we see here g, plosive stop instead of voiceless fricative. Everything depended on the place of the stress, because here in deka the stress is in the first syllable, and after this stress syllable came that consonant k. But in the second example, the first syllable is not stressed and the second syllable is stressed. If k is coming before the stressed syllable, it changed to voiced stop. Now, rhotacism. If the preceding vowel is unstressed, s in Germanic languages becomes voiced, that it changed into z. Eventually, this z becomes in West and North Germanic languages, not in Gothic. For example, Gothic Hausian, Old English heeren, German hören, to hear. Gothic Lesian, Old English lären, German lehren, to teach. Gothic Mesa, Old English Mara, Old High German Mero, more. Gothic Kiusan, Chaos, in Kiusan is infinitive, Chaos past singular form. Old English Chaosan, Chaos, Kuran, Koren, to choose. Gothic Husd, Old English Horde, Old High German Horde. In this way, we can explain how this pair in English was, were, and is, are, came into existence, from what words, from what forms they developed. As you see, were developed from the form waren. Was is from was, and is, are, developed into are. Next, stress in Germanic languages. The problems related to the stress is discussed in the branch of phonology called accentology. As one of the leading linguists who investigated the problems of accentology of the Germanic languages, as one of the professors who analyzed the accentology of the Germanic languages, we can name Katznelson Solomon Davidovich. Also, a great contribution to learning the problems of the stress in Germanic languages was made by the linguists like Makaev, Desnitsky, Zhirmonsky, Dmitriev, Kuznetsov, and others. So, in all Germanic languages, the initial root syllable of each word is stressed. Werner's law showed that in some cases the root syllable in Germanic languages was originally unstressed. The stress in Germanic languages was free. That is, different words, different syllables could be stressed. This system is found in Slavic, Greek, Sanskrit, and etc. Later, a fixed stress system came into existence in Germanic languages. Next item, substratum theory. This theory was proposed by the French linguist Antoine Meillet. Antoine Meillet was born in 1866 and died in 1936. The term substratum means underlayer, sub under, stratum, layer. By this theory, Antoine Millet tried to explain the first consonant shift and the change of the stress in Germanic languages. Change of the stress in the Germanic languages. See, tribal language first of all, then languages. According to this theory, Germanic languages arose when a part of Indo-European tribes conquered some other non-Indo-European tribes living in the north of Europe in the 4th millennium before Christ, and they took some changes different from other Indo-European languages. In the first case, Indo-European languages and non-Indo-European languages. Non-Indo-European language serves here as a substratum. From non-Indo-European languages, some features were accepted to Indo-European language. Therefore, this we name as substratum. Influence of the substratum language. Second case, we see Indo-European languages influenced non-Indo-European languages, and this is called superstratum. That's the influence of Indo-European language to the language which existed before Indo-European in somewhere in the 4th millennium of before Christ. Next, third case, Indo-European and non-Indo-European, they mutually influence each other. We find traces of non-Indo-European in Indo-European language and traces of Indo-European in non-Indo-European languages. Therefore, it's this name called adstratum. These terms were introduced by Vittorio Pisani, Bertoli, and Bonfante, Italian linguists, representatives of the trend called neolinguistics. Lengthening of consonants. A consonant except R is lengthened if it's preceded by a short vowel and followed by the consonant Y. For example, Satyan, Setan, which means to set. We observe three changes here. A changed into E, T was doubled, E was lost. See, these three changes took place in one word. Other example, Stapian, Steppan, to step. Sayan, seggan, to say. Framian, fremman, to perform. Talian, tellan, to tell. Swafian, swefan, swibban, to kill. Hliahian, hliahan, hluhan, to laugh. As we see in some words, there we find a small star. It stands for a reconstructed form or hypothetic form, or a form which was not written, which was not registered in written records.